All right. So we are going to dive deep into some news that's pretty fascinating and honestly kind of concerning.
Yeah.
You shared with me a bunch of articles, all from the Associated Press, about President Trump's recent visits
Yes.
to areas that have been hit by disaster in California, North Carolina, just days into his second term.
Right.
And
This was in January of 2025.
yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So these visits seem to give us a look into how he sees disaster relief,
Yeah, I think that's right.
which is really important now more than ever,
For sure.
especially with how often these events are happening and how intense they are, most likely because of climate change.
Yeah. And that's something we should probably talk about more later on.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, these visits really do
Yeah.
give us a glimpse of how he's thinking about this whole thing.
Yeah, so our mission here is to understand not just what Trump said and did on these visits, but why it matters
Yeah.
for disaster response in the U.S. in the future.
Exactly.
What could be the lasting impacts of his actions?
Yeah, that's what we're here to figure out, right?
Yeah.
How do these early moves maybe set the stage for how his entire administration is going to deal with preparing for disasters and recovering from them?
Exactly. Okay, so let's get into it.
Okay.
One of the things that really shocked me when I was reading these articles was that Trump said that he's thinking about getting rid of FEMA.
I know.
And he called FEMA a disappointment, bureaucratic, and slow.
He didn't hold back.
No, he did not.
I mean, it was a pretty bold thing to say, right?
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what is he really so frustrated about when it comes to FEMA?
Right.
Is it truly that he thinks they're inefficient, or could there be something else going on?
Yeah, he even said that he thinks we should just skip FEMA altogether
I know.
and just give the money for disasters straight to the states.
It's a pretty radical idea
Yeah.
when you think about it.
But could states even handle big disasters all on their own?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
To really understand what could happen if he actually did this, we need to understand how FEMA works,
Okay.
like what its role is in disaster response.
Okay.
So FEMA is really the main player in how the U.S. responds to disasters.
Okay.
They coordinate everything with state and local governments.
Uh-huh.
Think of it like
Okay.
an orchestra.
Okay.
FEMA's like the conductor,
Okay.
making sure all the different instruments are playing together.
So FEMA basically steps in when a disaster is too much for the local people to handle.
Exactly.
Oh.
They come in, they assess the damage they provide, aid like temporary housing, grants for rebuilding, and they even offer counseling for people who are in crisis.
Wow.
It's a huge operation with a lot of moving parts.
So Trump wanting to get rid of it, that seems pretty extreme.
Yeah, it's a big deal for sure.
Is there like any time in history where states have managed huge disasters by themselves?
Well, states do have their own agencies for emergency management,
Okay.
and they have a big role to play in responding to disasters. But for really massive events, like Hurricane Katrina,
Yeah.
having that federal coordination through FEMA has been essential
Okay.
to effectively get resources where they need to go
Okay.
and support the people who need it the most.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be way harder to make sure aid is given out fairly and efficiently?
Yeah, possibly.
Especially when a disaster affects multiple states if we didn't have FEMA.
You're right.
Yeah.
It could also lead to some states handling things better than others,
Right.
depending on how prepared they are.
Okay, so we've got Trump criticizing FEMA, and then things get really interesting.
Yeah.
When we look at his contrasting approaches in California and North Carolina,
Okay.
in California, he went to areas that had been devastated by wildfires.
Right.
And it was surprising to see that he actually had a pretty friendly interaction with Governor Newsom,
It was.
especially considering they haven't always gotten along in the past.
Yeah, they've clashed before.
Yeah. And Trump even threatened to hold back aid from California at one point. Right.
So this visit, it makes you think that maybe in times of crisis, people can put their political differences aside,
Maybe.
which is encouraging.
Yeah, it is.
But at the same time, Trump was really pushing for getting rid of permitting requirements
I know.
to speed up the rebuilding process.
Yeah, he wants to cut through the red tape,
Right.
which kind of goes back to his whole complaint about bureaucracy.
Exactly.
But it's complicated.
Yeah.
Because the permitting process, even though it can be slow, it's there to make sure that buildings are rebuilt safely
Right.
and that they meet building codes,
Okay.
which is super important in areas that have been affected by hazardous waste from the fires.
So is Trump putting speed ahead of safety in this case?
It's a worry, isn't it?
Yeah, especially considering he's downplayed environmental risks in the past.
Yeah, like with asbestos.
Yeah.
This whole thing about deregulation in disaster recovery needs to be looked at very carefully.
Right.
Is there a way to balance getting things done quickly
with making sure things are safe in the long run
Mm-hmm.
and that we're protecting the environment?
Mm-hmm.
It's a tricky balance,
Yeah.
for sure.
It makes you wonder if these streamlined permits could be used to favor certain areas
That's possible.
or industries over others.
Definitely something to think about.
Okay, so we've got Trump criticizing FEMA, potentially favoring deregulation.
Right.
And then there's his visit to North Carolina, which was hit by Hurricane Helene months ago.
Okay.
And his message there was completely different.
It was.
He was talking about how residents felt forgotten by the previous administration,
Yeah.
and he promised to get things fixed up.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it really highlights those long-term recovery challenges
Yeah.
that stick around long after a disaster isn't in the news anymore.
He even said that RNC chair Michael Whatley would be in charge of coordinating recovery efforts.
Yeah, I saw that.
Even though Whatley doesn't have an official government position, this brings up some questions about whether disaster relief efforts are becoming too political.
It does.
Is it right for a political party official to have so much power in what should be a nonpartisan government function?
That's a good question.
Especially when you think about the possibility that states might be treated differently based on their political leanings.
For sure.
What happens if a state that's run by the opposing party gets hit by a similar disaster?
Right.
It just creates this feeling of unease.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if you can trust the government to respond fairly and effectively
Yeah, you have to wonder.
to people who need help regardless of their politics.
Yeah, it undermines that trust.
These two different approaches in California and North Carolina really show how complicated disaster relief is.
They do.
But it feels like there's a huge factor looming over all of this
There is.
that we haven't talked about enough yet,
Okay,
and that's climate change.
you're right.
Both Hurricane Helene and the California wildfires were made worse by our changing climate.
Absolutely.
And this is only going to become more common.
That's what the science tells us.
So how does Trump's approach to disaster relief, with its potential focus on deregulation and partisanship,
Right.
hold up in the face of this growing threat?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
That is the question.
It is. Yeah, it feels like we're in uncharted territory here, you know?
Yeah.
If climate change is making disasters more frequent and more intense,
Right.
doesn't that mean we need a stronger, more coordinated response, like from the federal level?
Absolutely it does.
But if Trump is pushing for this more state-centric approach,
Yeah.
wouldn't that make it even harder to adapt
It definitely could.
to these growing challenges that we're facing with climate change?
Yeah, because climate change doesn't care about state boundaries.
Right.
A huge hurricane or wildfire can affect multiple states at once.
Yeah.
And that requires a coordinated response across those states,
And wouldn't a system where different states are doing their own thing?
with different levels of preparedness and resources,
Exactly.
potentially leave some communities more vulnerable than others.
It could. And it also raises concerns about fairness.
Yeah.
You know, states with fewer resources might struggle to get ready for and respond to these big disasters.
Right.
And that could just make things worse.
Exacerbate existing inequalities.
Exactly.
So even though streamlining permitting sounds good on the surface, it seems like it could actually backfire
It's a risk.
if it means we're compromising safety and environmental protection,
Right, because we need to think about the long term.
especially in the long term.
We have to think about disaster preparedness holistically.
Okay.
It's not just about reacting to each event as it happens.
Yeah.
It's about making our communities stronger at every level,
Right.
on the local level, all the way up to the federal government.
Which brings us back to adapting to climate change.
Okay.
What are some things we can do to actually become more resilient as these threats get worse?
Well, one important thing is to make our building codes stronger
Okay.
so that they can handle more extreme weather.
Okay. So make sure new buildings can withstand stronger winds, heavier rain.
Yeah, exactly, like future-proofing our infrastructure.
Okay.
And it's not just about new buildings.
Right.
It's also about retrofitting older structures
Okay.
to make them more resilient, too.
Got it.
What about natural infrastructure?
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term,
Yeah.
but I'm not totally sure I understand it.
So it's basically using nature's own defenses to protect us from disasters.
Okay.
Like coastal wetlands, they act as natural barriers against storm surges.
Okay.
And forests can help prevent landslides.
So it's about working with nature instead of trying to control it.
Exactly. And it's usually more sustainable and cheaper in the long run.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But all these adaptation measures, they sound expensive and complicated.
That can be.
How do we even start to put them in place on a large scale?
It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. We need federal funding and policies that encourage states and communities to adopt these measures.
Okay.
Public-private partnerships could also be helpful.
And it seems like getting the public more aware of these issues is really important too.
Yeah, for sure.
People need to understand the risks.
Absolutely.
And be involved in finding solutions.
Education and community involvement are key.
Yeah.
We need to give people the tools and knowledge
Right.
to take charge of their own safety and preparedness.
Okay, so we've got building codes, natural infrastructure, public awareness.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't the most basic solution to just address the root cause of the problem?
You mean climate change?
Yeah, climate change itself.
Of course.
All these adaptation measures just buy us time.
That's true.
We ultimately need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow down climate change.
Yeah.
And it seems like Trump's approach, with rolling back environmental regulations and focusing on fossil fuels might actually be moving us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
His policies seem to put short-term economic gains ahead of long-term environmental sustainability.
Right.
And that could have serious consequences for how prepared we are for disasters in the future.
So it feels like there's this real conflict between what Trump's doing and the reality of climate change, which is getting worse.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah. How do we reconcile these priorities that seem to clash?
That's the big question we're facing right now.
We need to find ways to bridge the political divide.
We do.
And come to some agreement on solutions that work for both the economy and the environment.
That's the
And it seems like the first step is just admitting that climate change is real.
It is.
And that it's a threat to our communities.
We can't ignore the science.
Okay. But let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
I want to talk about Trump demanding that California make policy changes in exchange for aid.
I know.
He mentioned things like changing water policies and voter ID requirements.
Right.
That's concerning.
It is.
Because it makes you wonder if disaster relief is being used for political purposes.
It does.
Is it ethical for the federal government to use aid as leverage?
Right.
To push a political agenda?
Especially when people are in crisis.
Yeah, especially during times of crisis when people are so vulnerable.
It feels like it goes against the whole point of disaster relief.
Exactly.
Which is supposed to be about helping those in need.
Yeah.
No matter their political beliefs.
It creates distrust.
It does.
And it could even discourage states from asking for help when they need it.
Absolutely.
Because they're afraid of the political strings attached.
And it makes you question whether aid will be given out fairly to everyone in the country.
Right.
Or if it will be used to reward allies and punish opponents.
We need to make sure that disaster relief stays nonpartisan.
Absolutely.
That it's focused on getting help to the people who have been affected.
Right.
Regardless of their politics.
That's the bottom line.
This whole situation is so complicated. And there are so many potential problems.
It's a lot to think about.
It really is. It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that we as citizens have a voice in
Yeah.
how our government responds to these challenges.
That's right.
So what can we do? How can we make a difference?
Well, for starters, we need to stay informed
Okay.
and engaged in the issues.
Okay.
Educate ourselves about the risks we're facing,
Yeah.
the policy decisions being made,
Okay.
and what could happen as a result.
So reading articles like the ones you brought to this deep dive,
Yeah.
going to town hall meetings,
Mhm.
getting in touch with our elected officials.
Exactly. The more we know, the better we can advocate for policies that make our community stronger.
And protect us.
That's right.
It's also about holding our leaders accountable,
Yes.
demanding transparency,
Absolutely.
and making sure that the money for disaster relief is used responsibly and ethically.
We need to make sure that money is going to the people who need it.
Yeah.
And that it's being used effectively.
So it's not just about what the government does.
Right.
It's also about what we do as individuals.
Yes.
And how we're involved in our communities.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in building a more resilient future.
And that brings us to a really important question.
Okay.
What can you, the listener, do to get prepared for potential disasters in your own community?
That's a great question. And there are some practical things you can do right now to be more prepared.
Yeah, so we've talked about the big picture stuff, Trump's policies, climate change, the role of FEMA.
Right.
But let's make this personal for our listener.
Okay.
What are some concrete steps they can take right now
Yeah.
to be more prepared for a disaster?
Well, first things first, you got to have a good emergency kit.
Okay.
It should have at least 3 days worth of food, water, and other supplies for everyone in your household.
Okay, let's break that down a bit.
Okay.
What kind of supplies are we talking about beyond just food and water?
Think about the things you would absolutely need if you had to evacuate.
Okay.
Or if the power went out.
Okay.
A first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, a hand crank radio.
Okay.
So you can get news updates, blankets, any medications you need, and copies of important documents.
Copies of documents? Like what specifically?
Things like your ID insurance policies,
Yeah.
medical records, anything you would need to prove who you are.
Yeah.
Or to get access to important services.
Okay.
It's also a good idea to have some cash on hand.
Okay.
Because ATMs might not be working during an emergency.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Where should people keep this emergency kit?
Oh, that's a good question.
Should we just stuff everything in a random closet?
No, ideally you want it to be somewhere you can easily get to.
Okay.
And in a place that everyone in your house knows about.
Okay.
Like under a bed or in a hallway closet.
Okay.
As long as it's not buried under a bunch of other stuff.
Okay, so emergency kit's ready. What's next?
Okay, so having a plan is just as important as having the supplies.
Okay.
You need to sit down with your family or whoever you live with
Okay.
and talk about what you would do in different emergency situations.
So things like, where would we go if we had to leave our home?
Yeah.
How would we contact each other if we got separated? Exactly. Figure out where you would meet, both near your home and further away, in case you can't go back.
Right.
Make sure everyone knows the evacuation routes and has a list of emergency contacts.
Yes, all of that.
This seems pretty straightforward.
It is.
But I think it's easy to put it off.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Especially if you live in an area that hasn't been hit by a disaster recently.
That's true. But you never know when a disaster could strike.
Yeah.
It could happen anywhere at any time.
Right.
And being prepared could literally save your life.
Okay.
It's about reducing the chaos and panic when something bad happens.
So you're not just talking about physical safety.
Right.
But mental and emotional preparedness, too.
Absolutely. Disasters can be really traumatic.
Yeah.
Knowing what to do, having a plan, it gives you a sense of control.
Okay.
And that can help you feel less stressed and anxious during a crisis.
That's true.
And it's important to remember that preparedness isn't just about what you do as an individual.
Okay.
It's also about how strong your community is.
Okay.
Get to know your neighbors. Find out if there are any local groups or initiatives you can join.
Okay.
Having strong connections in your community can make a huge difference in how well you all get through a disaster together.
So it's about fostering this sense of collective responsibility.
Yes.
Looking out for each other, recognizing that we're all in this together.
Exactly. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, with Trump wanting states to handle more of the disaster relief.
Right.
Strong communities can step up and fill the gaps,
Yeah.
especially if help from the federal government is uncertain or slow.
That makes sense. Wow, this conversation has really given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It's so clear that being prepared for disasters is more important than ever.
It is.
Especially with climate change making these threats worse.
And it's not just about surviving a disaster.
Right.
It's about coming back even stronger, learning from what happened, and creating communities that can withstand whatever comes next.
That's a great point.
So to our listener, I hope this deep dive has given you some knowledge and some practical steps that you can take to be more prepared.
Yes, please take action now. Don't wait for a disaster to happen.
Yeah, you have the power to make a difference.
And remember, knowledge is power.
It is.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's all work together to create a safer, more resilient future.
Absolutely.